In this video, we're going to talk about your camera's zebras, or as our friends across the pond would say, zebras. Zebras. So what are they? When are they useful? And how do you use them? Okay, Google. What noise do zebras make? Sound like donkeys. What is going on? Dan Fox here. Welcome back to the channel, and today I'm going to break down the basics of using the zebras to expose your shots. Thanks to the channel CC Subtitles for suggesting this one. It's a good counterpart for the histogram video I released back in July. Both the histogram and the zebras help you judge your exposure, but you'll tend to see histograms much more in photography, whereas zebras are used a lot more heavily in videography. Now, some of this is simply due to the fact that zebras are a video-first tool and they haven't been available to photographers historically. But with the rise in popularity of mirrorless cameras and the benefits they provide, we're seeing more video-focused tools make their way into prosumer cameras and professional photography cameras. So if you use a mirrorless camera, you'll have access to both histograms and zebras. And if you're using a Sony mirrorless camera in the Alpha series, zebras are even a little bit extra awesome. These would be cameras like cameras in the A7 series, cameras in the A9 series, the A1, and even crop body cameras like the A6400 and 6600. But I'll get to why zebras are even more awesome in these cameras a little bit later, so make sure you stick around to the end. So what are zebras? Well, in short, they're a setting you can turn on in your camera that allow you to visualize brightness levels of your shot before you take the shot. And in this way, they're very similar to the live histogram on your camera, but they're also very different. And these differences are what make them a great tool to use alongside your histogram. So if you recall from my live histogram video, and I'll link it up here if you have no idea what I'm talking about. But in that video, I talked about how the live histogram shows you a range of tonal values in your scene as you're taking the shot. Now, if you have the histogram turned on, it shows all the time. But zebras are an exposure warning that target certain values and only show up when those values are reached. So it looks like a stripe pattern, and the camera lays this pattern over the parts of the scene that meet those certain brightness values that you've set, and you can see it real time in your EVF or at the back of your camera. Now, this is especially useful for video, especially for videographers that don't have big crews of people to help them get the perfect exposure settings, or if they're run and gun and don't have a lot of time to set up their shots. And the second reason that zebras are so valuable is because they only show up on the parts of your scene that meet the brightness values that you've set. And this has great utility for photography too, because not all parts of your scene are going to be at the same brightness value. So I'm going to talk about video first, and then we'll talk about how it also applies to photography. Now, when you're shooting and more importantly editing video, you don't have quite the same latitude to fix things in post-production as photographers do. So you have to be a bit more careful when exposing your scene and exposing for your subjects. Now, this is especially true if you're trying to capture footage of people specifically. If you over or underexpose your footage, things can get kind of weird in your footage, especially with colors and contrast, and it's really hard to fix them in post. Now, there's a ton of nuance in exposing specifically for video, especially when you start getting into things like picture profiles and log gammas, but I want to try to keep this video simple and to the point. So for now, I'm going to assume that you're just getting started out, like you're going to shoot video that you want to use straight out of camera without any color correction or color grading. But I do need to briefly hit on one small tangent that will help me explain why you might need to target skin tones with zebras. Video editing and delivery uses a scale called IRE, which is an acronym for the group that developed the standard. This scale was developed to standardize broadcast levels, and it's still in use today. And it's meant to make sure that your video can be seen across the widest variety of devices possible, all the way from old televisions to the smartphone you have in your pocket. Now, you'll see it represented in video editing waveforms with a scale from 0 to 100. With 0 being pure black and 100 being pure white. Now, the reason I'm mentioning IRE in this video is because when you're exposing for skin tones, you're usually trying to target a specific value or range of values for those skin tones. For instance, with my skin color, you'd probably be trying to target my face for 70 to 75 IRE. For someone with dark skin, you might need to shoot for 60 IRE, sometimes even as low as 50 to 55. Now, the problem is, unless you have a cinema camera or an expensive monitor that has something like waveforms or false color on it, you can't see where the IRE values are in your exposure. And the histogram will not be helpful for this. It's totally useless for targeting specific luminance values. But this is where zebras come in. You can set your zebras to target specific luminance values, and when those values are hit, they'll show up right on your camera. So let me show you what I mean. So I've got a little bit of an interesting setup here. Let me explain this real quick. My wife didn't want to volunteer to be the subject of our tests for this video. So I've got one camera, video recording the back of a photo camera here, which then I have pointed at a color checker over here, and the value of this color checker is that it shows a range of skin tone chips, so it could act as if we were exposing human skin tones. Now the first thing, of course, that we need to do is to turn zebras on. Now in my particular camera here, it's on camera 2, page 7 out of 11. Depending on your camera, you might find it in a variety of places, but you're looking for something that's called zebras or zebra settings, something like this. And you're just gonna go in there and you're gonna toggle it on, and then you'll see you have a second menu option that you can choose values from. Now I would recommend, if you're gonna use this a lot, setting it to some kind of custom button so you can access it quickly, but for now just access it through the menu. And you see here, it might be kind of hard to see, but on the left hand side you'll see, right now I'm in custom values, but you'll see 100 plus, 100, 99, etc. And it goes down to 70 in this particular case. So Will, since we were talking about 70 IRE initially, let's go with 70. So if I choose 70 here, then that means that I'm targeting the value of 70 specifically. So if I'm going to change my exposure, anything with the chip where the zebras appear on the chip is exposed to 70 IRE. So in this case, since I'm targeting lighter skin tones with that value, then I would change my exposure until I see the zebras show up on those chips. Now, if I'm in video, I'm ideally not changing the shutter speed, but for the sake of this example and to change the exposure quickly, with this weird setup, I'm just using the shutter speed for now. So what you can also do, and I have this set up in a custom menu here, so instead of picking a specific value, oftentimes it's more valuable to be able to pick a kind of a narrow range of values that you know when you're close. So this is why I typically use one of the custom, and then I'll set the standard plus range, the IRE value, and then a plus or minus value. So another thing to note here is a benefit to using these custom modes as opposed to one of these pre-selected on the side is you usually have more flexibility. So, you know, if I wanted to go lower or even really low, maybe I was targeting some IRE value for something special, I could turn this, you know, way down. I keep going anywhere from 0 to 109. So this doesn't have to be just the values that are selected on the sides. All right, so the next way you can use zebras is as a simple highlight overexposure warning, and this applies to photo and video. Now this is really useful when you want to make sure that you're not overexposing or clipping your highlights. Now if you use your zebras this way, anything that's overexposed will be covered up with the zebra pattern. And once you see your zebras, you just back off on your exposure a little bit until you no longer see the zebras, and then you know your highlights are safe. Now again, assuming you're shooting in your default video settings, or if you're shooting JPEG for images, you could just set your zebra value to 100 plus. Now you could also set your zebras just a little bit lower to let you know early, and this will give you a little bit of wiggle room. Personally, I find this the most useful in videography since the scene is dynamically changing, but if you set your zebras too low for photography, it can get really annoying because they just cover everything over and get in the way when you're trying to compose your shot. So here's how you can set up your zebras as a highlight clipping warning instead. So to set this up as highlight clipping, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go back in here to my zebras, and instead of the standard plus range, I'm going to select lower limit. Now it remembered my last setting, but you could, again, you change this up and down like I showed you before, and what this will do is anything over that limit then will show up as zebra. So if I turn this way down, for example, and put this at, let's put this at 60, everything showing zebras is exposed over an IRE value of 60. So where this is actually useful for your overexposures is if you set it to 100 plus. And this will help you protect your highlights if you're shooting, if you're a JPEG shooter, or if you're just shooting, a standard video profile out of the box. Anything with zebras on it here when you're at 100 plus means that portion is overexposed. Now in this particular case, that black chip is just being reflective because I've got all this at a weird angle, but if I were to raise this exposure up, so in this case, let me just drop the shutter speed down here. Now you can see all these white chips are showing up as overexposed. So this white chip over here, these guys over here. So what I would do is once I saw the zebras on my highlights, I would just back down a third of a stop. And then I know my highlights are protected. Now again, if you're a person that likes to give yourself a little latitude, you can come in here instead of setting it at 100 plus, you would set your lower limit a little bit lower. Now, you don't need to use a custom value. Oftentimes they get the 100 plus. Most cameras I think will have this, but be warned, if you go down here to 100 or 95, etc., again, these are targeting specific values. So if you overexpose over those values, the zebras will not show up. So you need to make sure you're using a lower limit and then put in your value manually. Now, I wanted to mention something really important specifically for photographers who use Sony Alpha cameras to shoot raw images. And those are my caveats here. Sony Alpha, raw images. And this is not something you're likely to find out without getting really into the weeds about how your camera works. So this is my attempt to hopefully help you stumble across this information. Anyway, do you remember how in that histogram video I shared that the live histogram that you're seeing is based on a JPEG preview of what your camera is actually seeing in RAW? Well, when you're shooting in RAW, this makes it really challenging to know when your highlights are actually starting to clip since you have that extra latitude. You'll have part of the histogram touching the right side, but you can't actually tell if you've pushed it too far or not. And usually that process means you get it as close as you can, you take the image, then you check out your blinkies or your RGB histogram after the fact and have to tweak to make sure that you're capturing as much of the dynamic range as possible. Well, in Sony Alpha cameras, the zebras are not constrained by the same limitation that the live histogram is. Instead of being based on a compressed JPEG version of your image, they're truly raw. And this is a huge deal for people that use an ETTR or expose to the right method for exposing their images. Now, why you should expose to the right, that's a topic I'll save for another video. But practically speaking, this means that you have another tool that can pick up the slack for your histogram when you need to squeeze as much dynamic range out of your sensor as possible. Now, Sony shooters who shoot in certain video gammas will be used to being able to use the zebras to judge their highlight clipping in the super whites, or the area above 100 IRE. And this is a very similar use case for photography. For photographers, this means you use your histogram to do 99% of the heavy lifting, but at times where you really need to push your exposure, you can use your zebras to alert you of any overexposure in real time before you take the image, and this will be based on the raw data. So let me show you how you'd set your zebras up for this use case. All right, and this last example is going to be really quick because we've already covered most of this in the previous one. We'll just go back here to our lower limit. Instead of setting it to 100, because you're shooting in RAW and you have more latitude, now you're just going to bump this all the way up to 109. And this will now show, again, we're going to look at these white chips over here, not this weird reflection. But if we were to try to expose those white chips, I'm going to keep turning this down. There, bam, now all of a sudden we have zebras showing up on those white chips. And I know officially, you know, I'm in RAW format. Officially, those highlights are blown out, so I need to back it off. Same kind of process as we were talking about if you're shooting JPEGs before, just now you have more latitude. Now, the interesting thing is if you look down here, look at this histogram. It looks like it's totally touching the right-hand side, and for the histogram, it is. But these zebras are giving me that little extra bit of information to let me know that I can push it a little harder. If I were to turn my shutter speed down here, see my histogram moving back to the left, but if I turn it back this way, it looks as if I'm blowing out my highlights on the histogram, but I actually have a little bit of room left before they actually become blown out. So this can be a really useful tool if you're shooting in RAW. Now, I know some of you may be wondering if there are any other camera systems that have their zebras use the RAW version instead of the JPEG version. And the answer is I simply don't know. On one hand, I feel like there must be some other manufacturer that started doing this, especially one of the ones that use Sony sensors. But on the other hand, I feel like if there was, we would have heard about it by now. And it's almost impossible to find anyone else talking about this. In fact, I only found out about this because I stumbled across a video from a Sony camera ambassador, and this led me down a research rabbit hole. By the way, his name is Mark Gaylor, and I'll link the video I'm referencing in the comments if you're interested. And if you're anything like me and you really love to nerd out in all the minutia of the Sony camera systems, he's a great guy to follow. Plus, he gets access to every single camera that Sony releases, and I'm just a dude that had to buy my cameras with my own money. Anyway, I hope this video helped you understand zebras a little bit better. As always, I'm all ears if you have other topics you'd like me to cover. And thanks to those of you who've suggested videos so far. I'm definitely adding them to my ever-growing topic list. Before you leave, don't forget to pay that like button some attention on the way out. And I'll see you in the next video later on.